This meeting is being recorded.
I swear to God, this thing changes every time. Maybe not. Maybe
the voice kind of has a different
Yeah.
fluctuation.
Yeah. What is going on, guys? Blacklisted Voice, episode 62, and we are talking about overcoming injuries. So Austin's joining us today. Thanks for jumping in, Austin.
Yep. Hey guys, let's do this.
Yeah. So basically, we're just going to get a huge rundown of injuries, kind of break down as much as we can about injuries in relatively an hour period, kind of mindset around injuries, how to deal with them, whether they're a big thing that we kind of want to push in this podcast is the fact that if you are training to be competitive and pushing your body, injuries are unavoidable in sport. So, and kind of the thing that kicked this off is a couple of my clients have been experiencing some injuries as of late, some lingering stuff. And then I've been talking to some people inside of the fitness, or not fitness, but competitive space as well. And I think it was like 3 people that I've talked to within the last 3 weeks have all been like, yeah, I had to take time off from squatting because my knees hurt so bad after this season last year, or I've seen them get knee injuries, and worked with some people who have had it. So yeah, that's kind of the driving factor behind this podcast, is just kind of maybe get a little bit ahead of injuries that are going to start accruing as this competition season kicks off here, and as we start to get into like more intensity and more competition throughout the rest of this year. So yep. I guess we'll kind of just start by like building a base. And Austin, you had some good points about how if you're pushing your body to its limits, it's bound to happen in a sport.
Yeah, because I mean, within like competitive CrossFit, or if you're a competitive power lifter, like world's strongest man, or even like your normal, say like popular sports like football, basketball, things like that. Mm-hmm. You're trying to reach like a maximal output on whatever, say, that skill level is of the sport. And within that, you have to stress the body to produce the best result. And within going through that, like everything you do, whether I'm making a cut on a basketball court, I'm doing a heavy power clean or anything like that, you're stressing the body. Now, if you want to be like, say you're your average like gym goer that's maybe like 40 years old, I want to be healthy, I want to play with my kids. Well, then your goal should be, I never want to be hurt. You're going to lift lighter to moderate loads. You're going to be generally like fit, but you're not reaching that point in like, okay, I'm going to see how fast I can truly go through this, or I'm going to see how much weight I can truly lift. Because then it's getting in like, most people are training in this like safety bubble that's right here. But for us, we need to kind of take like one step outside. And it doesn't mean that things are getting like chaotic and crazy, but you do need to stress the body to a point to where you can adapt. And there's certain points in training or in competition where you kind of, in lack of better terms, you send it. And then sometimes things happen. And like you said, it's kind of like inevitable that like if you have a 10-year like CrossFit competitive career, you're bound to at least have one injury. And that's because of training your body to not necessarily full maximal limits all the time, but like pretty much maximal limits all the time.
If you have a 10-year CrossFit career and you have one injury,
you're doing pretty good, actually.
You're killing it. That would be amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. I think so. Like you kind of hit on the intensity aspect of like developing injuries, and like a lot of times what ends up happening in that intensity aspect is we move outside of a range of motion that our body is strong or comfortable in. And what ends up happening at that point is either one, you might have some sort of tissue tear of some sort, because the body didn't develop strength in that position. Very normal. Or you start getting kind of these tension pains where your body's like, hey, we're not strong here. I'm going to create extra tension here to protect this position. And now all of a sudden something gets tight. generally it's muscle fiber tissue that's getting tight, but it's also going to be sending a pain signal through your central nervous system up to your brain about, hey, this hurts, stop. Generally, a pain signal is a stop signal.
Correct.
You have individuals like myself who ignore that a lot of the time, and you end up getting in real big trouble. But that's kind of what the pain signal is there for. So those are kind of like the things that pop up inside of like an intensity related injury where you're working outside of that kind of comfort zone. And then the other thing that we end up having is just repetitive use injuries. Nobody moves perfectly. Like nobody moves to the maximal efficiency of whatever it is that they are trying to do. And over time, you just accrue wear and tear on the tissue. So for example, like when we're trying to build muscle mass, we're focused on kind of like breaking that muscle fiber apart. And over time, if you just keep breaking it, something along that line of muscle fiber is going to have an overuse injury and get inflammation of some sort at that point in time. And I think one of the biggest things or correlations to that is like swinging a golf club and swinging a baseball bat. And if you guys pay attention to baseball at all or softball, players are injured all the time in that sport. And it's because you have relatively the same movement patterns over and over and over again in both of those sports. And so I think those are kind of like the two areas that we see a lot of the time inside of CrossFit, because it is such a sagittal up and down sport. Everything's anterior loaded or posterior loaded, and we're moving everything kind of in a vertical plane. We tend to get these overuse injuries or kind of like intensity injuries that you were talking about.
Yep. No, and going at that, I mean, when you're thinking about like movements, whether it is like you're doing a clean and jerk or you're doing a thruster, you're doing a wall ball. You could see all three of those in like a single competition, but all of them are generally like the same movement pattern. Just varying levels of like difficulty on each. So
yeah,
going with like the overuse on that, I mean, it makes sense. Or you're pulling things from the floor. You have a deadlift, you have a dumbbell snatch, and you have even like a burpee with like a hinge pattern, but you're like overuse. But that's what we are training for in the sport. You have variance and variety, but your body only moves in so many directions in so many ways. Yeah, it's a different movement, but the body is moving in space relatively similar between each of those movements.
For sure. Yeah. And like, to kind of caveat that, an example at Granite Games this year is our first workout of the weekend. We had 30 power snatches, and then we went and snatched heavy. So it's like, you're literally doubling up on movements in the same day, and that is also kind of the beauty of the sport, is the fact that it is kind of chaotic, but at the same time, it is very limited in the planes that it moves in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Especially when you're talking to like how you threw in like the golf and baseball aspects, because of the fact like it's kind of like an inverse relationship between the two sports. So like if your golfer is doing a lot more like your vertical movement, say like you're squatting, you're deadlifting, you're doing things like that, so you're strengthening your body in the non-rotational aspect. So if they did all their training in doing like banded chops, or you're doing wall ball side toss, whatever the case is, well, then you're just doing the same thing over and over and over and over. And so like, but the opposite can go for like, say, CrossFitters, where say to think about the side of like injury prevention, that's where like some of your accessory work could be doing, like you're doing a banded pal-off press, you're doing different like side plank rotation aspect movements, like just things to prevent kind of that midline, or even like tension on the knees. I mean, know myself, I'm a very casual golfer. I love it. But if I golf over the weekend and I squat on Monday, my knees are bugging me. And it happens. So it's like putting your body in different planes, but it's not always doing the same thing. Yeah, you want to get better at the sport, so you got to practice whatever that sport is, but you should also be doing things outside of that that are counterintuitive to your sport to make yourself a healthier individual.
For sure, yeah. And if you do follow baseball, there's a company out there called Driveline, and they've been doing some pretty like cool stuff in regards to like throwing with pitchers and well, with pitchers specifically, and they're doing a lot. And maybe they didn't pioneer this, but this is kind of where I saw it from. But they've been doing a lot of like backwards throwing, so they're throwing in the opposite plane of what they're used to strengthen kind of like the stopping musculature of that arm motion. So, when you think of accessory work in CrossFit, a lot of it has to do with strengthening what we don't get in the actual sport. And so a lot of that is just kind of rotational components of the body, and like, kind of weird planes where maybe you're doing a lateral crossbody step over, a lot of unilateral work. And this is kind of getting more into like that injury prevention kind of standpoint.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like a lot of like rotational work, lateral crossbody step overs, lateral lunges. Honestly, like if you were to like take a cable machine and just do like cable rotational rows, like stuff like that, or even like side hand over hand pulls would be like a kind of a cool thing to incorporate on a sled. And you'll start to get touches on a lot of things that you're not getting in the sport, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess kind of the next thing like we can kind of run into here is, so let's say you have something starting to pop up here, like your shoulders kind of, there's something going on in your shoulder, and you're like questioning, like, should I work out today? Should I not work out today? Like, what is this? I think there's a big thing between pain and then an injury. And I don't know if maybe you had a lot of experience with this when you were working with hockey guys at all inside of the weight room or at the
Yeah.
U, or
Well, and within that, like pain versus injury, like I would consider like pain is you can still train through pain. You just have to find ways to train through pain. So
Mhm.
like say squatting, I'll just use a squat with the knees example. Like squatting is bugging my knees, but if I put you in a Bulgarian split squat, your knees feel fine. So
Yeah.
like you can find different ways to train through pain. Not saying I want you to be in pain, but we can still train. Now, if
Mhm.
you like have an ACL tear in your knee, well, I'm not going to have you do Bulgarian split squats, or I'm not going to have you do those things. So like you would be a little more on the side of like avoidance in the movement versus actually training through the pain that is there. And
Mhm.
then it's kind of like the same thing. I mean, growing up playing sports, yeah, like a lot of old school like mindset, like football coaches, things like that, where it's like, if you're sore, you can play. If you're in pain, go talk to the trainer. Things like that. So it's like being sore or like, oh, this movement's kind of bugging me. Well, there's still ways that we can work out through it.
Mhm.
Now, if you physically have like an injury that needs attention, well, then yeah, we need to address that. But there is a kind of like fine line between the two.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a fine line, and like pain is kind of like that first signal of like, hey, something's not right here, and we need to make a change to something. I
Yep.
think a lot of it too comes down to, what time of the year you're in. And like, this is why we're big on communication with our athletes. Is like, hey, if you're feeling something, like, let us know. And a lot of the time that pain signal that you're getting in your body could be like, hey, we're going to take 2 days off of your shoulders or your knees or your back or something. And now all of that tension dissipates and you're like good to go for another 4 to 6 weeks.
Yep.
And like, that's kind of one of the big reasons we're big on communicating with our athletes, is because it could be something as simple as like, hey, let me adjust your design. We're going to take 2 days off here from whatever it is that's bothering you. You can still get training in, but now we're not putting you further in a hole that is going to cause an injury later on down the road.
Yes.
uh,
Well, that's
And
kind of what we had kind of talked about that before, how you mentioned like, oh, you're good to go for another like 4 to 6 weeks.
mhm,
And you had brought it up earlier in the podcast where like, um, as much as we want to, not everybody moves perfectly. Like
mm,
from like your upbringing, different sports, like especially if you played contact sports, you might be like maybe you have a 1 degree shift in your hips, and that's
mm,
how you're going to be for the rest of your life, or shoulder, or whatever the case is. So there
mhm,
might be times where it might seem like a revolving door where you're like, oh, every like 3 months, this is kind of nagging me.
mhm,
But if I take some time off, then I have another 3 really good months of like training, and then I take
mm,
like 2 weeks off. And that could be just like your normal cycle. It's not saying like we want you to be in pain, but it's like we're still progressing, but it's not the point where we're injured to where it's like, okay, I got to take significant time off on this.
yeah,
It's just like going through a normal season. I mean, if you're a runner and say you're having shin splints, stress fractures, whatever, like that's kind of an extreme example, like in the
yeah,
lower
so
half. Yeah,
shin
that's an
splints.
extreme example, but like shin splints is that kind of like precursor where, oh, I'm starting to kind of feel that. Well, let me take
Mhm,
some time off here, do some band tibs or do some recovery work, and then I'm
yep,
good to go for another like 3 months strong and running.
yeah,
Because
yep,
then you want to
yep,
kind of stop it. Otherwise, it can get to that point of having like those stress fractures and everything else. So it's like having
yeah,
that push for like the guidance and be like, okay, like you said, shoulder, take 2 days off, you feel fine. Maybe two
yeah,
days off turns into 2 weeks off, but it's not like an inevitable or like a never ending thing where it's like, I'm never going to be able to do this again. And that's where I feel like a lot of people get caught in that trap of
mhm,
focusing on what they can't do versus looking at the reality of what they can do.
yeah. I think we'll kind of get into that like that point that you brought up is awesome, and I think we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But I wanted to kind of touch on a little bit more of like that. Hey, what can you do versus what is causing pain, and kind of bring it back to like that Bulgarian split squat. Like, yeah, you were talking about how your knees might hurt while you're squatting, but if you put them in a Bulgarian split squat, they're good to go. And that is another kind of like communication aspect that is important for your coach to know, or why we do want to have communication is because yeah, maybe you can't squat, but maybe you can Bulgarian split squat, or maybe you can't upper body pull vertically, but you can upper body pull horizontally. And now we can continue to keep some sort of training stimulus in there without causing more damage to the whatever that pain signal is, but you're still getting better at the sport or a component of the sport or training aspect, whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
Um, and so like, as you kind of progress as a coach, you get a little bit better idea of like what happens when people are getting injured, what kind of injuries are, you know, happen from what, and you have a better idea of like the questions to ask your clients, um, so that they can give you some more feedback, so you can kind of like direct where it is you can go with their training. Like, okay, strict handstand push-ups are hurting my AC joint. Okay, well, what about is it just like one side? Is it both sides? Like, what's going on in your shoulder? Well, if I kind of get into this position, I'm good. Okay, well, let's throw in some tall kneeling, landmine presses from a side. And so now you're still kind of working that same range, and we can give you some cues of like, hey, really make sure to focus on your scapular retraction on this. Now all of a sudden, like as you're doing that, it might work out to be an activation exercise. And you're like, things feel kind of good in there. And maybe the athlete is just like, at the end of my session, I'm going to try out, a strict press with the barbell. And they're like, oh, that was good. That felt good. And then they message the coach and like, okay, well, let's, progress from there and like see, in 2 sessions, maybe let's try some negatives on a handstand pushup or something. But
Yeah.
that's kind of like, you can always do something. It doesn't, you don't, if you're in pain, you can always do something. You don't necessarily have to take time off. Now, an injury is absolutely something that's different, but
Yeah. But even going off of that, like with the injury aspect, like if you're injured, I like to use this example a lot. And I think I've told you it before too, but like I had a knee surgery probably 4 years ago. And
mhm,
this is kind of when I was switching over from like your normal strength and conditioning realm with like my hockey guys into like CrossFit space. So a lot of the barbell movements, strength, conditioning, things like that were fine. But I had a knee surgery basically right when I started CrossFit. So I was like, well, all I can really do is gymnastics right now. So like I was on crutches in a full leg brace when I got my first ring muscle up. So like there's still things that you can do through like injury to progress you as an athlete. So like you have shoulder things going on, and maybe like, hey, I need my legs to get stronger. My shoulder's bugging me. It hurts to hold the bar in a back rack position. Well, then maybe we switch to like a safety bar to where you're set up pretty good. Things feel good. You can still focus on like lower body strength. And so there's always different ways that you can train around the injury without specifically training the injury itself. That's where the difference in like the pain in the knee. Yes, in a Bulgarian split squat, you're still getting knee bend, but it's a different tension on the knee than a back squat. So, but I'm not going to knee bend somebody who has like a knee surgery. So, but there's 75% of else of your body that we can train.
Yeah. So, I think that's a really big component to when you are in pain or when you do have an injury. Like, there is always something you can do, especially in CrossFit, like something you can do to progress yourself in the sport. And honestly, in all sports, like unless you're literally paralyzed, and God forbid you ever have that happen to you. There's usually something that you can do to improve a component of your sport. And honestly, it might even get down to like mental fortitude and mental training. Like maybe you are, relatively incapacitated for your sport, but there's a timeline for you to get back, and you can do something like a lot of, mental work or, visualization or whatever it is to get you kind of like ready for the competition aspect of your sport. There's always something you can be doing. But I think an injury in my mind is something that is like, I would define it a little bit more like you're going to have to go and get surgery for it. I think outside of surgery, everything in my experience has the ability to get worked through and worked on and kind of recover to the point where you can continue to exercise. How would you define injury?
I think, because like you said surgery, but I think anything where you need to go seek like additional like care to where maybe you're like, you need a surgery, or maybe someone doesn't need a surgery, but say they like dislocated their shoulder, and they got to be in like a sling for a period of time. So like anything that you need to seek like an actual like medical treatment, I would say would be like your injury side of things. Anything that's like where you can work through, like you said, or work around would fall into that category of like pain.
So how would you like classify, or like at what point in time would you go seek medical, like, or extra help?
If you're extra help, I would say like if it's starting to, because in the gym, when you're in the gym, even if you're just doing a recovery bike for an hour, you're still adding like say stress on the body. That's its own thing in the gym. I would say if it's starting to affect you outside the gym, like my knee thing was an old thing from like rugby, stuff like that. Like it hurt just to drive. I remember going to like a movie and I couldn't sit for the duration of the movie with my knee bent because it just hurt. So anything that would affect you during like normal day-to-day activities, that's probably when I would. Not when I'm like, oh, I'm going into the gym and I'm squatting. Well, I'm kind of expecting something to happen if something isn't feeling right to begin with. But just sitting during a movie, my knee shouldn't be hurting.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. If it's affecting you outside the gym in daily life, then that would be the time where I might seek like some additional like care.
Totally. Yep. And I think I said surgery kind of because like we do have pains and just kind of like nagging things on a day-to-day when we are a competitive athlete that you can go and get extra help for, massage, dry needle, cryotherapy, cupping, you name it. That does start to kind of alleviate some of those pains. I think probably a better definition from my end would be you've and maybe this is more like practical, but like you've tried everything, like you've gone and or
You've
you've
like
tried.
exercised all your resources and
Yeah.
nothing is improving.
Yep. Yeah. So that's kind of like when I would say is like you're starting to get into that like injury standpoint where it's like
Yeah.
you've gone and gotten the extra help. You've tried manipulating your movements. You've tried all these activation exercises, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're sitting there like, yeah, this thing's not getting any better. I've had no relief. I've done nothing. Like I need to go get an MRI, or the swelling's not gone down. I need to go get, legitimate medical, like doctor's office help, MRI, X-ray, imaging done to see what is going on there.
Yep. No, I
So,
think that clears it up. That should at least like portray an image of where people can kind of fall, oh, am I in this category or I'm in this category?
yeah, for sure. So, I think too, and there are injuries that kind of last a short amount of time. So like you can have an injury where you are actively going and getting extra help in it or for it. It's just a slow process to recover from it, if that makes sense. So like
Yeah.
to give an example of that, before Fitness Experience last year, I heard something or felt something kind of go in my shoulder. I felt it tear. This was 3 weeks out from Fitness Experience, I think. And so I was going and getting extra help to try and help recover that, speed that process up. And by the time Fitness Experience rolled around, I was able to do the upper body pulling movements inside of that workout, but I hadn't been able to do any upper body pulling leading up to that point. And so, there are injuries that you do sustain that maybe they are a 2-week, 3-week thing, maybe even longer than that. But, getting that extra help will allow you to kind of like recover from that process.
Correct.
So, okay. I think now let's start to get into kind of like the psychology of like, hey, maybe you do have something that's taking 3 weeks, or you are seeking extra help, or like, what's the psychology of dealing with an injury, like, or yeah, true injury.
Yeah. I think from the very first thing, whenever you have like say pain, because pain is going to be that first response that your body has, or like injury, don't get into the mindset of the sky is falling instantaneously. Because I feel like a lot of people will get caught in that trap, like, oh, I did something, shoulder I felt, or my knee, my back, whatever that is, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm done, I'm injured. And it's literally just, it's very easy to process, and it comes really fast, like negative thought, and it's hard to like process and like keep a positive outlook on things. So like I feel like step one is don't get caught in the trap where like the sky is falling.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And like that is a much for an unexperienced athlete and somebody that hasn't had a lot of like maybe pain signals or injury or anything like that, and their career's kind of young, that is an extremely hard thing to do. I had been injured quite a few, and sorry, let me backtrack here a little bit. And even if you are an experienced athlete, it's still an extremely hard thing to do. Avoid that mindset. So like I had quite a few injuries leading up to, there's kind of like a significant one that I had where I popped a rib out of place. I think something else was going on in there, and I just could not clear the inflammation that was like lingering in my joint. And this was, man, like a 8-week process of like, I'd kind of gotten it better, re-injured it. Nothing else I was doing was working. And I eventually got to the point where I had to take like 3 weeks off from not doing anything. And I had, one of the things that I think was the biggest detriment was I got depressed during that time frame. And I was very kind of like mopey and like, man, I can't do what I want to do with my body, and just kind of like living in this, it's harsh to say, but self-pity, right? And a lot of my other injuries, I was just kind of like, oh, well, I felt something there. And I remember being 21 and being like, guess I'm just going to live with this for the rest of my life. You know, the
Like
testosterone.
you're 60 years old or something, that the
Yeah.
life is
It's
over
like,
at that point.
yeah, the old, I would have been all state, but I tore my rotator. um, but that was the longest, and knock on wood, thank God, but that was the longest thing that I had uh, that lingered for me. Um, and a lot of that took me out of training, I should say. I had a lot of other pain signals that stayed with me, but and I think a lot of that had to do with just this kind of self-pity, I'm never going to be able to do what I want to do again, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, to your point, just being optimistic about the recovery process is, the one of the best things you can do if you do have something pop up.
Yeah. And then within that, like, optimism and everything, even if you can't, like, for you, like, you took 3 weeks off completely of like exercise.
Mhm.
So like if you physically can't do anything for a prolonged period of time, there's still things you can do to at least like alleviate some of that like stress or some of like the need to be physically like moving. So
Mhm.
like say if something's going on in the ribs, like you had mentioned, or shoulder or back, like going out and something as simple as like going for a walk can
Mhm.
make such a huge difference for when you get back like into the gym versus it's very easy with just like technology now to where, oh well, I'm going to lay on the couch and I'm going to watch 15 episodes in one day of the show,
Yeah.
or and I'm going to have that like self-pity
Mhm.
kind of like attitude towards it versus like, okay, well, I can't do this, so let me try to do something that can at least be like productive in my normal
Mhm.
life too,
Mhm.
because like unless I mean, granted, some people like this is their normal life. Professional athletes, I mean, it's getting more prevalent in CrossFit and everything else. But like, do something where it's like, okay, if I do this task, it'll be good for my family. If I do this task, it'll be good for me financially or whatever.
Mhm.
So like, there's still things you can do to at least have that like a positive outlook. Because then if you everything out, and that kind of goes into a different topic, but if like everything's going well outside the gym, you're probably going to do better inside the gym
Mhm. Mhm.
versus carrying that stress with you. So like if you do need to take off significant time, it's kind of like, we'll get all your other ducks in a row. Make sure
Mhm.
you're still using your time productively, even though you're not training. And that way when you get back to training, you don't have to worry about those things.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, to kind of caveat off that a little bit, like doing a little bit of like research for this podcast, one of the big things that happens when we do get injuries and why we kind of get into like that mopey, depressed, kind of self-pity state is like we attach so much of our identity to being, competitive exercisers. Doesn't matter if you're
Mm-hmm.
13 or you're 63, like that is a part of who you are as a person. And there's nothing wrong with that. And kind of when you do have an injury happen, like it's almost like you're being robbed of part of your identity and
Yeah.
being able to like, figure out, hey, what other parts of my identity can I explore right now, like you were talking about. And there was this tips from a Dr. Mike Ayogi. I found this on a blog, so hopefully I said his name right. But one of his things was build identity outside of your sport, with your downtime. So maybe that's reconnecting with old hobbies that you had. Maybe that's developing your coaching ability on the floor with your clients at the gym that you're coaching at, or just like your clients in general. That can always, teaching is the best way to learn, right? So like now you're all of a sudden you're learning more about your sport too, which is kind of, finding ways to improve while you have that downtime, or finding different avenues to improve. And maybe that's something completely outside of your sport, maybe some other hobby that you had in the past, or job, or whatever it is. So yeah, to kind of caveat off of your point there, Austin, is just like finding that other aspects of your identity other than just the exercise or the CrossFit identity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that too. I mean, everybody in a way lacks some like self-awareness and being like present in the moment and being like, this is who I am as a person. We want to identify with like, oh, I'm the person who can deadlift 500 pounds or
Mhm.
little like minute things in the grand scheme of like your life and like who you are. But as
Mhm.
soon as you take a small thing and you emphasize it, well, then it blocks out what really is going on. So I think like when you take that step back with an injury, like be self-aware and be like, oh, this is who I am as a person. This is things I can still do well. These are good things that are going on. And I think that goes into just other aspects of like mental health too. Because I mean, I have a lot of conversations with different athletes and like it may not be a physical injury, but there might be something mentally going on. And it's like, okay, well, that one thing or that one injury, because we're talking about injuries, like doesn't define like who you are. Like
Yeah.
take advantage of the positive things, make your own choices. Don't let this thing make the choices for you.
Totally. Yep. And I think like too running through some of he had kind of like 3 points at the end of this blog post is one of them is connect with other people going through the same thing as you.
Yeah.
Um, there's if you have a shoulder injury, I guarantee you can pull up Instagram and literally type in shoulder injury and find 50,000 other CrossFitters going through a shoulder injury or
Yeah.
a knee injury, whatever it is.
Yes.
Uh, so like just reach out to them and just get their perspective on it. Everybody's healing process is different too, and if you just kind of like chat with more people, you might find something that works super well for you. I you know I feel like I've had a pretty extensive injury or pain kind of like career in the sport, um, and almost every single one of my injuries has been a different healing process for every single one of my injuries. Uh, and that's even to say having some of the same injuries happen again. I've sprained my wrists 3 times in the sport. Uh, but by the third time, I had known about new methods to heal the wrist, and instead of it being a 6 to 8 week process of it being sprained, it was now a 4 week process because I had the knowledge base to kind of like stay off of it, uh, use CBD cream to get rid of the inflammation, do a bunch of Graston to get blood flow in there. Every injury is kind of like a learning opportunity, and it's an opportunity for you also to learn about other individuals' experiences and kind of what they're going through, what's worked for them. Because even if we you're back and forth with your coach or whatever, like there's only so much that one person can know. And when you go and seek other professionals' help, whether that's a physical therapist, chiro, somebody else who's also injured, there's going to be something that you pick up on that individual has done or worked for them that you can now try out and try to incorporate into your recovery process.
Yeah. And I like how you mentioned about like reaching out. This is bringing it into like more or less not the sport of CrossFit, but what CrossFit is as a whole. And part of the reason why
Yeah.
it was like created
Mhm.
is it's the whole like if people with better relationships tend to live longer. So
Mhm.
like if you are injured and it's like that doom and gloom, like woe is me, well then you're not doing yourself like any favors. But by reaching out to people and building a community, like within the shoulder injury space, I guess, of it, like you're gonna have a better outlook because you have other people that are around that are kind of going through something similar versus
Mhm.
just why is it me? And then as soon as you get into that why is it me, you're kind of like putting yourself or you're isolating yourself to where you're alone.
Mhm.
And that's gonna say it could shorten your competitive career if that happens over and over to the point where you're getting burnt out.
Mhm.
It could in like in the long run of things, if that just happens over and over and you're getting into a more like depressive state, say again, well, then that could like not just shorten your competitive career, maybe that takes a toll on your actual like physical health for like longevity of life and everything else too. So it's like reaching out to people, having resources, building a community, and like having good relationships. You're going to get through things way better than if you try to do things solo.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. And, kind of it's something you kind of hit on at the beginning of that point was, why me? And that's a very common thought process to have, like, especially when you get in, you just like kind of like recycle, like, through your mind, like, what could I have done differently to avoid this? What could I have done differently in my training? What could I over and over and over again? That's kind of like one of the first thought processes that you have. And that's a good thought, that is a good thought process to have from, again, that learning kind of perspective. Uh, but it can spiral you into that kind of depressed state where you're not reaching out to people, not trying to figure out what happened, and not trying to, like, you know, progress forward. You're kind of just like living in that past state. You're never just progressing forward and continuing to work through whatever it is that you sustained as an injury.
Yeah.
And in that blog post, there was a couple other thought processes that they popped up. Is another prevalent one is, will I ever perform again? And kind of how much will it affect my identity? How much will it affect my relationships? Like, how will those relationships change? And those are, I think, one of the big things to kind of move past those thought processes is accepting that those are okay thought processes to have.
Yeah.
And then moving on past them. Like, hey, it's okay that I'm thinking like this. Like, this is a very normal thing to have happen. Many people have been in those shoes, but now let's start being proactive about, hey, how do I start moving past these thought processes and get to the point where I am healing and, going and doing whatever training it is I need to do. And, a lot of that might be the, kind of relationship aspect of it that you were hitting on.
Yeah. And then I think how you said it's normal. I mean, everybody does it, like the why me, but say you go the why me, you spend like your 5 minutes, an hour, a day, whatever that looks like, to kind of feel or be in that space. Because I mean, you need to be aware of what's going on. You can't just be oblivious or blind to it. But then like the why is me, like why is my shoulder always bugging me? Well, then it could give you a rationale or a purpose to figure out, okay, let's problem solve here. So we're like, okay, this is going on, or it always happens when this happens. So it's like, okay, let me correct this so it doesn't happen again. Because then in that aspect, you can kind of be like proactive versus reactive, to where it's like, okay, let me try to prevent anything in the future versus every time it happens, I'm just reacting in a certain way. And then I think that you can also, like, it's a learning process. Every little thing you learned, your wrist injury, you had all three of them. By the last one, you're better off. And you probably took the time to go, why me? But then you didn't just stay there. You went into a mindset of like, okay, well, let's move past this versus this is the thing that a wrist injury is who I am. And it sounds silly when you say it, but it's like, it's easy to get caught in the trap of, oh, I'm always the one with a hurt back, or I'm always the one with this. And it's like, you don't have to be.
Yeah, it's kind of like your children living in that mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. The last wrist injury, I did not dive into that why me. I was more like, you fucking idiot, you punched the stands at Wadapalooza. What were you expecting?
Oh, that's a different story entirely.
Yeah. But yeah, I think I don't know, you got any closing thoughts here? I think we kind of hit on a lot of good stuff here. So
yeah, I think we went through that list pretty good. But I think, like, step one, don't think the sky is falling. There's always ways that you can work around it. Have good relationships. Talk to your coach. And everybody, kind of when you're going through that too, how it's okay to ask for like other help. Like, everybody has their like expertise in one thing, whether it's coaching, whether it's physical therapy, whether it's massage, whether it's dry needling, whatever the case is. Like if you expect somebody to be an expert in everything, that'd be like a false hope. So it's like reach out, talk to other people, build a team around you, and then that also in turn creates better like community aspect around like your life. And then so when something does pop up, you know you're not alone because I got person A, B, C, D, and E who have my back in this.
Yep. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think, you know, also coming to terms, like if you are a competitive CrossFitter, it's not if, but when am I going to get injured?
Yeah.
You know, it is a reality of the sport. As coaches, we want to try and make it so whatever injury pops up is not, um, you know, a career ender or a season ender or something like that. But when you push your body to its physical limits and you kind of stretch that rubber band thin, eventually that rubber band is gonna snap and something is going to break.
Yeah.
And so, you know, coming to terms with that, but then also really exploring your relationship with pain versus injury, and you know what is pain to you, what is a pain signal to you, what is an injury to you, like what's the difference between those things, what do they feel like, you know. I think it's a tough thing to talk about because it's not super qualitative and it is very subjective to each individual. And a
Yeah.
lot of that is kind of like exploring your own body and figuring out, you know, what that means to you. And then, you know, also building resilience to pain if we are going to be pushing our bodies to our absolute limits, I think is another kind of big thing to touch on. And then I am a huge proponent of this, and I will tell people this probably till the day that I die, but find as many healers as you possibly can. Massage therapists, like to your point, Austin, like build that community. Find as many healers as you can. Massage therapists, PT, chiro, you know, and not all the time will one PT work the best for you. Like don't just like categorize all physical therapists or all chiros in the same kind of boat. Each healer is extremely different, just like each coach is extremely different. So, you know, get out there and experiment and find people that you trust and work well with your body. So
Yeah. No, I think those are good closing thoughts.
for sure, for sure. Well, thanks for listening, guys. Hope you got something out of this one. And we'll if you guys are listening on YouTube, please give us a follow on Instagram, blacklisted.hq. Honor Fitness's Instagram is what again?
Honor Fitness MN as in Minnesota.
Okay. I'll remember that probably 3 podcasts from now.
Just put a little like MN like right behind.
Yeah. There we go. So give Austin's gym a follow, guys, if you're in the area or you want to kind of see what's going on in his community there. And then yeah, please like and subscribe, and we will catch you guys next time.
Perfect.